So welcome back to Smarter Athletes Program Design Principles. We're about to start Module 2, which does introduce you to a little bit of sports science with respect to the basic principles and what's kind of happening at the cellular level when we train and create a training stimulus. So we have kind of covered principles of programming, and that's when we were talking about exercise selection, making sure that our selections align with specific muscle actions related to targets and goals that we had and sport specific roles that we might have as an athlete. If you didn't get a chance to view Principles of Programming, the first module, I'd highly recommend that you do before starting this one. Now we are going to dive into a little bit of the sports science that is behind what's going on. So the reason for wanting to kind of understand some of these basic principles when it comes to underlying sports science is it will allow us to train smarter. And it kind of goes without saying that training smarter would also allow us to train harder. It would allow us to train more often. So for our intent and purpose, we're going to try to keep our references as specific to strength and conditioning as possible. We're also going to try to avoid going too deep down the road of biology when it comes to things like energy systems and cellular respiration. I'm going to save that for another presentation. But if you are interested in a more detailed and somewhat a little more science-heavy explanation of all this, please be sure to check out that Smarter Athletes presentation on energy systems. It will be available at strongerbcss.ca. All right, so when we talk about adapting to a training stimulus, we're really talking about what's happening at the cellular level. But when we just look a few levels above that and we generalize it a little bit, we're kind of talking about the idea of stimulus and response. And what we're trying to do is put enough stress on our bodies to kind of influence a positive adaptation. Okay, so this is a good type of stress. It is a physical stress, and yeah, we're definitely causing a little bit of damage at the cellular level when it comes to what's happening to those muscle fibers, but it's good. It's a level of stress that is going to produce an adaptation, meaning that essentially we're going to come back stronger. All right, so depending on which systems are at work and for how long, the various stresses that we place on our bodies are going to produce a certain level of repairable damage. And that damage is going to happen to muscle fibers that basically contract and relax as their job to the point of being so stressed out that they become damaged. Now, through proper recovery and using recovery in a smart way, our bodies are able to respond positively to these types of damage by creating stronger levels of defense for those successive training efforts. So for the next time, basically, I'm going to be more prepared for this the next time it happens is basically the reason behind the response. So the key word to kind of keep here is that one, positive adaptation. That's what we're basically looking to do every time we train. Unfortunately, we can't get to that point if we're not pushing ourselves outside of what is already our comfort zone. See, we already have this level of tolerance or this limit that is basically just before causing any of this damage to incur. So if we're going to go out and get a little bit of exercise and some fresh air and get our heart rate up, that's all good and well. But if we're actually looking to produce a training stimulus that's going to enlist a positive adaptation, we need to go a little bit beyond that level of tolerance at very least to make sure that positive adaptation is the eventual outcome. Now, I use kind of a helpful chart in the first module here, and I'm going to take it one step further here. I want to keep the goal in column 1, but rather than talking about the system in column 2 and the muscle action in column 3, I actually want to talk about the physical stress that needs to happen in order for that goal to kind of be, kicked into action. And then I want to talk about the response to that particular physical stress, and then what is hopefully the positive training adaptation. So I've got 4 good examples here. And again, this is something that you should be able to start to kind of do a little bit of research and fill out on your own if you are somebody who is interested in designing your own meaningful, purposeful training program. So of all the examples that we have up here, again, this is something that I would do as an application with a group if we had the chance to be in a classroom right now and speak to one another. This table would be blank and we would be filling it out together. But since we're not, let's just look at one of these lines here in a little bit more detail, and I kind of explain what we're hoping to get out of you with respect to response. So if the goal is to improve speed and power, and this might be for the sake of improving vertical jump, it might be for the sake of improving your 40-yard time, it could be for a variety of reasons. But again, the physical stress that needs to happen is a high velocity or a high speed sports specific movement, or a high velocity or high speed resistance training movement. In both of those cases, our bodies are going to create a new demand on our fast twitch muscle fiber system. So we're going to have these new levels of demand for our body's ability to rapidly produce force or rapidly develop force. Sometimes we call this RFD. So we have a new level of demand for RFD, rapid force development, and as a result, the training adaptation is not necessarily going to be to build more muscle, not necessarily in this particular case, but it is going to be to improve the activation and recruitment of our fast twitch muscle. So believe it or not, with respect to this particular system, we all have this untapped amount of fast twitch muscle fiber in our bodies that is probably available to us if we train it. Now, this would be a smaller amount in somebody who trains this system very often, and in somebody who doesn't do a lot of explosive speed and power training, you'd be really surprised at how much more speed and power you could start to actually, cash in on before necessarily having to increase the amount of physical muscle that was on your body. And this is referred to as recruitment. We're talking about asking muscle fibers that are already there to do a better job at going to work for us when we ask them to. So again, improving speed and power simply by activating those muscle fibers a lot more often through very specific sport-specific movements and high-speed resistance training movements. That in its own way is going to increase the demand for rapid force development, and the response from our bodies is going to increase the rate of recruitment of the existing fast twitch muscle fibers, those type 2 muscle fibers. Next thing I want to talk about here is probably new to a lot of us, and it's a really good and certainly by no means new way of explaining in fairly simple terms adaptation syndrome or adaptation syndrome theory. Now, this is an adaptation to stress. Okay, so when we talk about adaptation theory, this is certainly not my own. It's been around for ages. Some people will call me archaic for wanting to use these very specific charts and images, but I really like their simplicity, and sometimes we don't need to overcomplicate things. When we look at performance, and then we're going to talk about performance here as this black line that's kind of following this curve, in an ideal situation, we would produce enough of a stress on our body that cause general adaptation syndrome to kind of become activated, and that stress would kind of send us into what is best known as alarm phase in general adaptation syndrome theory. Anyway, it's alarm phase that our body kind of goes into, for lack of a better term, a little bit of shock, and if we can recover well, recover properly, and recover with the right kind of timing in mind, we will enlist a positive adaptation. Now, keeping in mind that this black line is supposed to indicate performance, we should see an improvement in our performance. Now, as time moves on, the unfortunate outcome here in this particular image is another decline in performance. So even though performance initially goes up after we recover well, there's a decline in performance in this particular situation because what follows the positive adaptation is detraining. So this would be a fine example of somebody who does a bunch of exercise and training, they recover really well and they perform really well, but then they stop exercising and training, and as a result that performance goes back down to its baseline or its starting point. So detraining is something that can certainly cause performance to, after increasing, decrease, and I think that kind of goes without saying. The red dot here kind of signifies where we'd ideally like to be after a positive adaptation, but that's probably as far as we'd like to go along this curve. And rather than detraining, what we'd probably prefer to do is create another alarm phase and another recovery and another positive adaptation. So rather than having this downhill curve, we have another step in the upward direction. And this is what is probably more preferred as an outcome, of course. So now we're going to look at that dotted gray line on each one of these increases in performance, that dotted gray line that curves off as the hypothetical and possible outcome if we were to detrain after our positive adaptation. But since we're not, since every time we recover and bounce back with a little bit more strength and a little bit more performance, and then we send our bodies back into that alarm phase with some really hard training, then we recover well and positively adapt once again. And here we have this kind of meandering but generally upward trend in overall performance, and we're never really falling onto that dotted gray line, hopefully, because we're not choosing to stop training. So this is someone who trains regularly and provides themselves with the right amount of training stress to produce an alarm phase regularly, and last but not least, recovers well and recovers smart. But the problem here is that we don't necessarily understand this through the same lens across all sports and all positions and all age groups and all body types and all of the other variables that could, affect the amount of training and the amount of training stress that everybody, needs to do with some level of variance. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution for everyone, and in some cases we have too much rest, and in other cases we have not enough rest, and in both cases we have a potential decline in performance. In a case with too much rest, this is somebody who is overusing recovery or inappropriately using recovery, relying on recovery more than they need to, so to speak. We actually have a decline in performance, despite the fact that the person thinks they're training meaningfully and purposefully. They're actually relying on recovery too heavily, and their performance is declining. Now on the other side of the coin, we have somebody who is afraid to rely on recovery, so to speak. We have somebody who's not resting enough. And as a result of constantly trying to send their system into a situation of alarm and not necessarily giving their bodies enough time to positively adapt through that recovery phase, they end up with what's really commonly referred to as overtraining. Overtraining might be better described as or better explained as under recovery. And I think this image on the right here gives a really good explanation as to why that would be. But again, this particular image is probably most suitable here to kind of show how recovery being used too often or not often enough can essentially have the same outcome on an athlete, and that is a decline in overall performance. And so that's the end of part 2, and it's a perfect segue into part 3. We are going to talk about the proper and appropriate use of recovery in your training program. Once again, if you have any questions, concerns, rude remarks, I'd love to hear it all. You can send me an email, derek.virgo@yrdsb.ca, or you can get in touch with me through the website, strongerbcss.ca.